On a chilly March night in 1975, 23 rebel motorcycle club members stood in the parking lot of the Kingsway Motor Inn on the corner of 109th Street and Kingsway Avenue. It was a blustery -12 out, but they wouldn't have noticed. They were too busy looking for improvised weapons so they could fight off 40 of Canada's finest elite paratroopers. The paras, armed with bats, pipes, chains, blackjacks, and, of all things, nunchucks, seemed to have the numerical and technological advantage. However, the rebels weren't to be outdone. They grabbed tire irons, chains, and even hoisted motorcycle batteries. But most importantly, they were about to teach the paras a lesson in something they should have learned a long time ago. A cohesive force is a powerful force. But before we get into the brawl, how did all parties involved get to this point? And what happened afterwards? Let's dive in. Kingsway is named after a 1939 visit to the city by King George VI. He would ride down Portage Avenue, which would be renamed Kingsway in his honor. The Kingsway Motor Inn, or just the Kingsway Inn, was run by one Ernie Wolver, seen here aggressively protesting smoking bans. The building was located at 10812 Kingsway Avenue, next to Kingsway Mall, at the time known as Kingsway Garden Mall. The inn would last until May of 2003, when it was demolished to make way for more parking. Ernie would declare bankruptcy in 2006. The Canadian Airborne Regiment was formed in 1968 as a rapid engagement force consisting of light infantry. Similar to the 1st Special Service Force and the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, they were organized not to win wars, but to cause a distracting action while the Reg Force could wreak havoc on the weakened front line. They were organized out of Edmonton's CFB Greasepaw Barracks and flew out of the RCAF station at Namao, right next door. They were an oddity in the Canadian forces, as most units would be organized out of eastern provinces due to the proximity to NATO's sphere of the Atlantic. When asked why Edmonton, General Jean-Victor Allard stated that the weather was consistent, flat prairies made a perfect area for jump training, and Edmonton's geographical situation being the gateway to the north would allow rapid deployment to northern bases if the Soviets invaded longitudinally. This was poorly received. The French troops hated the lack of French comprehension in the West, and the government disliked a rapid deployment force being so far away from NATO commitment areas. The folks over at Edmonton City Council seemed to dislike the youthful regiment and its rowdy antics, as well as the Army's insistence on occupying saleable land in Edmonton's northwest. However, there were supporters who enjoyed the paras' time here, and would fight to keep them within the wheat stocks. The regiment would host parades, show jumps, and do community outreach. They would try to show their best face while stationed at Greasepaw, and the upper echelon made sure of it. But with the regiment being so young, there was a penchant to have a few drinks on the weekend to cut loose. They would drink at the nearby Roslyn Hotel, but needed a larger watering hole that was friendly to the regiment. Or maybe they were just looking for a fight. The next closest tavern would be the Kingsway Inn. The only problem was, this was rebel territory. For this next segment, I'm going to refer over to my friend at Werewolf at the Movies. He reviews movies and rides motorcycles. So if you're into that, please go check out his channel. He's great, and he's a wonderful guy. So yeah, without further ado,
The Rebels Motorcycle Club was a biker gang operating out of Red Deer, Alberta, that was either formed in 1968 or 1969. The Edmonton police record the latter. They were part of the Big Four clubs vying for control over the vast highways of the prairies. The other four clubs being the Grim Reapers, the Warlords, and the Highway Kings, later to be the King's Crew. The rebels were the young upstarts of that quartet, making sure to mark out their territory using their violence and strategic cunning. They ruled over Edmonton in the 1970s from their clubhouse at 11522 82nd Street, along rivals the Warlords. The Warlords' membership skewed older and was made up of mostly offshoots from Edmonton's original biker gang, the Coffin Cheaters, and a gang called the Sinners. Between the two gangs, they chopped down any other club that wanted to start in the city. From 1968-69 to about 1997, the rebels were reported to have destroyed 15 rival clubs through either forced assimilation or brutality. While having a clubhouse is great, a place to soothe your aches after hard days of riding sure would be nice. That's when the rebels chose the Kingsway Inn as their official haunt. It was a brisk 7-minute ride and had capacity for the whole crew plus their old ladies. The inn was accepting of the rebels, to a point, no rowdiness or horseplay was tolerated, and the inn hired bouncers to maintain that rule. The rebels were respectful of management's wishes and mostly enjoyed themselves when not taking out a drunk civilian or two. One of those bouncers happened to be a moonlighting Canadian Airborne soldier.
On a cold Saturday night of March in 1975, a few of the rebels were drinking and playing pool at the Kingsway Motor Inn when in walks 30 French-Canadian airborne soldiers from one commando. From one rebel's account, they were tipped off by their squad mate who was the new bouncer and walked in looking for a fight. The squad came in swinging, jumping patrons and causing a ruckus on rebel turf. After 3 fights, the police were called and the airborne were ushered outside. Perhaps smelling something fishy, the rebels called for backup. The 30 airborne were let back in to a much emptier bar, but this time with an almost equal force of rebels to face. The airborne backed down. The night continued without much incident until the airborne bouncer removed a rebel patch jacket off of the back of a bar chair and dropped it on the floor. The jacket's owner approached the bouncer. Words were exchanged, and the other bouncers led the 2 men out of the bar. That was just the catalyst the airborne needed to escalate. A call went out to CFB Griesbach, and slowly the force men trickled into the bar. The rebels called for a translator, and by 11:45 p.m., 40 force members were staring holes into the bikers. The tension finally broke. An airborne shouted, "Appelez ces connards rebelles! Call those asshole rebels outside." The rebel translator responded, "Allô, c'est un rebelle." "Look, I am a rebel," and punched the airborne bouncer in the face. The fists flew as everyone tried to scramble into the parking lot. The band ran backstage, and once the combatants were outside, management locked all the doors. This was it. Nowhere to run, and no one wanted to run. 40 of Canada's elite airborne paratroopers versus 23 of Alberta's hardest outlaw motorcycle club. A mixture of rebel and warlord bikers and the one bouncer who backed them up, versus the might of the Canadian Army Special Forces. The gloves came off, and the chains went on. The rebels didn't have time to group properly, but surprised the airborne who expected an easy win. The airborne had come prepared with nunchucks, bats, steel pipes, and blackjacks, while the rebels were stuck with whatever they could find in the parking lot. A rebel trapped in the lobby's doorway grabbed a spare motorcycle battery and cracked 2 airborne skulls. The airborne answered back by downing 2 rebels leading the initial charge by way of chains to the stomach. A warlord assisting the rebels had picked up a broken hockey stick and disarmed a chain-wielding soldier. He slammed the stick into the forceman's torso, breaking 2 ribs and putting him out of action. At the 15-minute mark, the airborne took stock and could see they were losing. They fled and the rebels gave chase. But by this time, the police had shown up, and were sitting back watching the fight unfold, laughing to themselves. After 2 airborne soldiers nearly ran over a rebel, they finally drove in and put a stop to the battle. The rebels could claim total victory. Despite the dust settling and charges being laid, the war wasn't over. The Kingsway Motor Inn was sympathetic to the rebels, but their corporate overlords at Best Western banned all motorcyclists. The rebels had lost their home bar and were under attack from the Canadian forces. This called for emergency procedures. Armed with shotguns, they congregated at Rebel HQ off of 82nd Street. Through their connections, they discovered that the Monday after the battle, the Airborne went en masse to a sporting goods store in Nemeo near the base and bought them nearly out of baseball bats. The captain of the regiment was called by the store manager, asking why they would need that many bats. A locker search was immediately conducted at CFB Greaspaw, and everything from frying pans to large sticks were confiscated. A reprimand went out not only to the base, but was also put in the newspaper. Soldiers warned against retaliation. They were immediately shipped off to southern Alberta for drilling and maneuvers. The rebels would go on to absorb and defeat many more clubs vying for their turf. In a highly public ground fight, the warlords were defeated by the rebels at Warlord HQ in Riverdale. They would be repatched to the rebels in 1983. The Highway Kings would also fall to the rebels, only to be replaced by the King's crew. The Grim Reapers, Calgary's answer to the rebels, would expand into Edmonton and fight with the King's crew in Calgary, leading to the rebels expanding into Calgary and creating an alliance with the Kings. The fighting reached a peak in August of 1983 when the Kings and the Reapers fought one another after a bomb blast in Calgary Stampede Park that killed 2 men. In retaliation, an Edmonton-based rebel motorcycle shop was bombed as well. All of this infighting led to the Vancouver-based club, Satan's Angels, and the intercontinental Hell's Angels entering Edmonton and Calgary. This pushed the Reapers and the Rebels into an uneasy alliance, and eventually led to both clubs being completely patched over to the Hell's Angels in 1997. The Canadian Airborne Regiment would serve most of its early years providing security on Canadian soil. During the October crisis of 1970 in Quebec, the regiment was sent to assist with hunting the FLQ and maintaining martial law. A few years later, they were security for the Montreal Olympics. They would be sent to Cyprus as part of the UN ceasefire agreement between the Cypriots and the Turks, and would eventually leave Edmonton in 1977 at the request of the Defense Minister Barney Danson and General Jacques Dextraz of the Congo War fame. In an outgoing address to the regiment, the deputy city mayor of Edmonton didn't highlight any of the regiment's history. He just mentioned that they fought a few battles in the city, one at the infamous dive bar the Coffee Cup Inn, which really stuck in his mind. Their last mission would be the most scathing incident to hit the Canadian military up to this point, and arguably to today. In this next part, I'm going to talk about something called the Somalia Incident, and it's pretty disturbing. So, if you are any bit squeamish, I would turn away now. I'll let you know that because of this incident, the Canadian Airborne Regiment was disbanded in 1995.
Another dark chapter has emerged in the Somalia affair. This time, it's a video obtained by the CBC News World program, Ottawa Inside Out. It was taken nearly 2 years ago by Canadian airborne soldiers serving in Somalia. It features Canadian soldiers making racial slurs, and it was shot just before a Somali teenager was tortured and killed at Canada's base in Belatwain.
Corporal Matt McKay, a self-confessed white supremacist who said he'd quit the neo-Nazi movement at least 2 years before this video was taken.
Corporal McKay, what do you think about the tour?
Hey, it sucks, man. We ain't coming up near yet.
Turn around, let me see the back of your shirt, man.
Private David Brocklebank, acquitted of charges in the death of Shadain Aron, the 16-year-old Somali who was killed while in Canadian custody.
What's this operation called?
This operation here?
Operation Snatch Nignog?
Exactly, Operation Snatch Nig. Hold the gun out.
In the background, a silent Private Kyle Brown, now serving a 5-year term for Arone's death.
What's that used for?
Crack little small smallies. Breaking arms, legs, limbs.
In 1992, the Airborne were deployed in Somalia under Operation Deliverance. While there, the soldiers would record hours of video footage of them going on racist rants and threatening to kill the very citizens they were being paid to protect. A year into their deployment, and a captain of the regiment found a Somali teenager, Shadan Arone, hiding in one of their portable toilets. They arrested him and took him to the munitions magazine, where they proceeded to bind, strip, kick, and waterboard the teen. After letting him sit for an hour, 2 new force members came in with broomsticks and ration packs and proceeded to beat and sodomize Shadan. He endured 4 to 6 hours of torture, including being hit by a baton and having cigarettes being put out on his genitals. The Canadian public was stunned. An investigation into the incident painted a gruesome picture of the Canadian forces. The soldiers were seemingly unregulated and uncontrolled. The Canadian forces also provided the soldiers with an unregulated, untested, and unapproved anti-malarial drug called mefloquine that causes hallucinations, seizures, and panic attacks. Combine that with the codeine-based cough syrup they were handing out, and you have a deadly cocktail. Essentially, the Airborne were a regiment of racist, drugged-up youths who were given total power in a foreign country with no oversight. The entire regiment was disbanded in 1995 after the conviction of a few of its force members. And that is the long meandering story and the aftermath of the time a biker gang took down Canada's elite military commandos. Thanks for watching.